Hello, everybody. Welcome to Ongoing Mastery, Presenting and Speaking, the podcast and the interview. And today I have an interview with Laura Pecker, who I've known for about 150 years
Mm-hmm.
and is an expert storyteller. So welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So this is Ongoing Mastery. So it is evolving your craft, growing over time, learning, and obviously storytelling is a huge part of that. But before we get into the nature of storytelling, you've won a lot of awards. Can you give some of your background?
Sure, I'd be happy to. My degree is in folklore and mythology. And while I was in college, I met a storyteller on the street and my life just changed. It was one of those cataclysmic moments. I watched him perform and I thought, this is what I want to do. And it took me 5 or 6 years to try and figure out what it meant to be a storyteller. At the time, there were very few storytelling open mics or anything like that. But I figured it out, and I've now been a storyteller, a teacher, a coach, a keynote speaker, all those kinds of things for almost 30 years. And when you do something for long enough, if you attend to it, and if you're lucky, people will recognize it. So my most recent awards are an induction into the Circle of Excellence from the National Storytelling Network, which basically means that I am considered by the National Storytelling Organization to be one of the standard bearers for the craft, which is really heartening and humbling. I've written a couple of books on storytelling. They have won awards from Storytelling World, which is one of the other awarding organizations in the storytelling world. And most recently, I had a show in the 2022 Minnesota Fringe Festival, which is one of the largest in the United States. And my show won the Staff Pick Award, which means that the staff go to all the shows, and some of the staff thought that mine was the best, which was really delightful and wonderful because storytelling is such a, compared to other shows in a theater festival with lights and sets and dancing and singing and all of that, storytelling seems very simple, but they got it. And so they gave me an award to celebrate it. I've won others as well, but those are the ones that I think are most relevant to our conversation now.
Fantastic. And it doesn't surprise me at all because as long as I've known you, you've brought to storytelling a seriousness and a gravitas to it that really helped me take it seriously early on, which is really helpful because as you and I have talked about prior, now everybody and their dog is a storyteller. Like everybody.
Well,
to the point.
Everybody and their dog. Yeah, everyone and their dog is a storyteller, but they're storytellers because storytelling is fundamental to what it is to be human. Just as singing is fundamental and dance is fundamental and cooking is fundamental, but we might not all be good at it. So I have spent 30 years honing my craft and working on it and learning. And I was lucky in that I have a chunk of talent that meant that when I started, I was already a little bit ahead. But yeah, storytelling, many people think that storytelling is just funny or just folktales or just the angst-ridden personal story, but it's all of those and more. And I have always been interested in the way that storytelling connects us and breaks down barriers and helps us understand that even if my experience is not identical to yours, there's similarity and overlap. And so if we tell stories well and deeply and think about the meaning and listen deeply, we're much more likely to find common ground with one another rather than find reason to tear each other down.
And that's the thread that I want to pick up on because you've not only done storytelling at festivals and open mics and things like that, but you've done it in professional settings. And that's that's uncommon, isn't it? Or it used to be.
It used to be. It's still not blazingly common. So the field that I mostly work in is what is called organizational storytelling, which means applying the idea that stories are a basic part of what it is to be human to business and nonprofits. So I have worked with NASA, with the Society for Information Management, with large universities. I've worked with MIT and the University of Miami and other universities and other pretty big companies, helping them identify the stories that are important in their organization and then figure out what they want to do with them. So from those stories, if they collect them internally, they can extract data from them about how the organization is doing, what's the health of the organization. If they're going to apply them externally, then there's marketing and recruitment and all kinds of things. And internally, again, it's for onboarding and building your culture and all kinds of things. So I am fascinated by that kind of work because it lets me use the really creative part of my brain that can come up with a story off the cuff, and the much more rigorous linear part of my brain that looks at it and is looking for trends and data and information. And it's hugely fun. And what it also does is, when I go into an organization, most of the time when I'm brought in, there's 2 or 3 people who think this is really cool. And then there are a whole bunch of people in the room sitting there like this.
Mm-hmm.
But I get to woo them and talk to them about things like the neurology of storytelling and help them tell stories. And at some point, usually if it's a day-long workshop, usually about an hour and 15 minutes in, I see their faces shift and open. And it's amazing because all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden they're there and they get it and they want to do it. And by the end of the day, someone has cried and a whole bunch of people have said, I never thought about it that way. And it's transformative. It's amazing getting to go in and, help a bunch of people think about how to sell medications more effectively. And yet by the end, not only can they sell those medications more effectively, but they're much more interconnected with one another.
Mm. So what I love is that the people understand the power of words and that words have impact, but I don't know how many people who are not in a performance space really think about the fact that whatever they're doing when they're meeting or connecting or doing onboarding or whatever, that initial communication with people is really a dance of helping people get to a particular emotional place. How do
Mm-hmm.
you start that? How do you set up a space that allows especially very resistant people to kind of have that freedom to be able to be vulnerable?
So if I'm going to an organization, I will almost, particularly if it's a technical organization or a marketing organization or something that is much more, might see itself as more scientific and rigorous than, say, an arts organization, I will always start with neurology because I can point to studies, I can refer them to studies done by really significant organizations like DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency out of the Pentagon, looking at how storytelling works. And what those studies have shown is that when you hear a told story, so not when you're reading, not when you're watching most kinds of video, your body is flush with the chemicals associated with relationship building and with connection and with empathy. And it's measurable. It's measurable through blood draws. And additionally, our brains, if you're in a functional MRI machine while you're listening to a story, it's clear that your brain is much more greatly engaged by the blood flow to different parts of your brain than it is if you're watching a video or reading. And the parts of your brain that are engaged are not only sensory parts, like listening and seeing and smelling, even though you can't really smell it. In a well-told story, that part of your brain might be engaged if there's an aroma that's important, but also the parts of your brain that are involved in action. So if I tell a story in which I'm chopping wood, if I tell it well, my brain will actually think I'm chopping wood, and so will the brain of the listener. So I start in these organizations with this kind of information, with this information about neurology that has been really well studied. And then I will say something to the effect of, this makes sense, because we've been telling each other stories for tens of thousands of years, for 10,000 years. And yet we've been reading for most of our families. We've been reading for 4, maybe 5 generations. And for video, there are probably people in this room whose parents didn't grow up with a television set. So video is within living memory, the arrival of video information. And our brains just haven't had time to evolve. So if I start with that, that starts to break down the resistance.
Okay.
And then I give them a simple prompt. A time when you did something at work that made a difference, that helped someone. And I send people off to share stories. And again, I see people sitting there like this. But what happens while they're listening to the stories is they start to lean forward and their faces open up. And then when they tell their story and they're looking down at the ground because they're embarrassed with this stuff, everybody else is leaning forward. And then afterwards, they say things to each other like, I never knew that about you. Or, wow, that's amazing. And all of a sudden, there's a connection. And for all but the most hardened people, this is effective. I've worked with people who have autism, who are diagnosed with autism and are on the autism spectrum. And I've seen it work with people who are theoretically less able to process emotions, and yet they do beautifully. And it's because stories help connect us, because that's what our brains are wired for.
So thank you. This is awesome. I don't know if I told you this or not in previous conversations, but in my ongoing mastery journey, there's two things I'm focusing on in 2023. One of which is to take my natural improv skills that I've developed over time and to actually train in them. And the other is to bring storytelling into my work, because that's not something that I'm trained in. It's not where my gifts lie. How do I start?
Well, first off, improv and storytelling are like this. There are people who memorize their stories, but because storytelling is something we use every day in casual settings, you already know how to improvise a story. So the first thing that I would say to you is, you know how to do this. And then what I would say to you next is, there are a million open mics in Storyland these days. Many of them are online. So find an open mic and go and listen to people telling stories and notice what you like, notice what you think is terrible, and there will be some of both. And then try it, jump in. It's like, you can read all you want about how to ride a bike, but you won't be able to ride a bike until you get on it and risk falling. But you're not going to fall often, and you probably won't fall hard. So I know that might sound like a trite answer, but like so many things, the way to become a storyteller is to do it. And to not do it from paper, to think through the structure of the story, to maybe have an outline and try it from an outline, because otherwise you're going to worry about getting the words exactly right. And acting where you get the words exactly right is an amazing skill. That's not storytelling. Storytelling gives you some flexibility with the language so you can dance with your audience more effectively, because that's what storytelling is. It's connecting with the audience.
And see, that's interesting to me, because I was thinking of storytelling through the lens of e-learning, my previous field. And I bring storytelling style into the content I was sharing, and to do narrative with people, because that helps learners. And I was going to write it down, but I like the idea of getting a loose structure and then going and doing, like, Moth has a whole bunch of open mics all over the place. And I've attended one of their main ones, and I was looking at some of the small ones where I guess they have pieces of paper in the audience and they just randomly pick people in the audience to come up. I know for most people that would be, they'd rather drown than do that. I find it both terrifying and exhilarating. So I'm going to go ahead and do it at some point. But I like the idea of just live throwing yourself in. I didn't think about it in an improv setting. I thought about it as, you have to structure it. You have to do the beginning, middle, and end. You have to make the narrative flow. So I thought of it analytically rather than from the performance aspect.
If you learn your story from an outline, so there's a little girl who lives with her mother in the woods. Her mother says, kid, go take the stuff to your grandma. Don't stop and don't dawdle. And so the girl puts on that red thing that her grandma made her and starts walking through the woods and stops to pick flowers. And there's a wolf. right? So that's not really telling you the story. That's remembering key points in the story. Learning it that way means that when you are in front of your audience and you take that breath and you look at them and you start, when they laugh, you can spend more time on the things that are funny. If you hear them sigh when you're talking about the light coming through the trees, then you can spend more time with that light. I know many, many people who need to learn their stories from a script, and that's fine. But with people who are comfortable with improv or intrigued by it like you are, learn it from an outline so you can dance with the audience and respond to them more readily. Practice ahead of time, practice with your family, practice with someone who you know you're safe with. Call me up, practice with me. But the outline gives you more freedom. And the moth is everywhere and does amazing work. But there are many, many other open mics as well that are less structured and less pressure.
Oh,
And
okay.
so you can go to storynet.org, which is the website for the National Storytelling Network. And they have listings of regional events, most of which are not the moth and most of which are much, much more relaxed. If you want to do a folktale at one of those venues, you can. And folktales are kind of fun to start with because there's no pressure of telling something out of your life. They might be a good place
Okay.
to start. So there are many resources available, but start by going to storynet.org. I'm so sorry. I'm having allergies, so my voice is all funny right now.
Well, as we said before we started the recording, you do sound like you. You just sound like a more Eartha Kitt version of you, which is kind of awesome.
Mm.
A little more, a little more smoky. I like it. So,
Mm-hmm.
what if people want to know about you? How do they find out more about you?
There are a lot of ways they can find out about me. The three easiest are several different websites. laurapacker.com, which is my storytelling website where I have storytelling, coaching, and facilitation, so workshops. There is thinkstory.com, which is my organizational storytelling website. So if you're intrigued by the idea of bringing storytelling into your organization, that's where you should go. And then you can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/Laura Packer Storyteller, where every Monday and Wednesday I tell a free folk tale at 4 p.m. Central, and I leave them up there. So if you want to hear some fun, fairly light stories, you can go there. You can also support me on Patreon if you're really intrigued by what I do. So you can go to patreon.com/Laura Packer and help me bring more stories into the world.
Fantastic.
I'm
So
also
as a
on,
wrap,
all of your other social media.
okay. So yes, so
I'm
you're on
also on
all the
Instagram
things.
and LinkedIn and places like that. Yep.
Are you on
You were
TikTok?
saying.
So I have to ask,
I am
are you?
not. I'm working my way onto TikTok. Yeah, I'm working my way there.
I am not. I'm not on TikTok. I suspect that I would only be able to do embarrassing things on TikTok, so I probably shouldn't.
Not so bad necessarily. I do
That's true.
embarrassing things all the time.
So as we wrap up, what advice would you give people who are working on presenting and speaking skills, how they want to bring story and narrative through lines into their work? What other places should they look into?
So first off, I would say good for you, because bringing in stories, especially out of your life, and letting yourself be a little vulnerable is the way to connect with your audience. They will feel far more connected to you with a little bit of that authentic self through a story than they will if you only give them facts and figures. So good for you. If you're looking for ways to grow those skills, I will first say I can help you. I do a lot of coaching and a lot of workshop facilitation. There's also the National Storytelling Network, which
Mhm.
has resources, all kinds of resources, workshops, links, websites, all different kinds of stuff where you can learn there. The Mid-Continent Public Library, which the website is MYMCPL, offers free online storytelling classes. And if you're looking to
Okay.
learn more about organizational storytelling, then I'd urge you to look at my work at thinkstory.com. I'd also urge you to read The Story Factor by Annette Simmons, which is a fantastic overview of why storytelling belongs everywhere and the kind of difference that it can make.
All right, fantastic. And I want to just tie back to the fact that while we've been talking about doing emotional connections and journeys, that you have indeed worked with MIT and NASA. So it's not like that this has all been light and fluffy.
Mm-mm. No, I've worked with some pretty significant organizations that really wanted to figure out how to use stories more effectively. I work actually, most of my organizational work is with technical organizations, technical and scientific. Um, and they, I get the crossed arms at the start, but then they realize that this will make a difference not only in their work, but in their lives. And I've heard from organizations years later saying, we have a better workplace because of you. And that makes a big difference.
Fantastic. So thank you for coming on. A final question. In your ongoing mastery for your own craft, what is the next thing that you want to tackle?
There is a book that I'm working on that is a set of stories that are my favorite characters to tell stories about. And I've only told them, they exist in some pretty rough writing, but I would like to publish that as a book and be brave enough to commit those stories to print and share them more widely. For
Okay.
me,
All right.
that takes a lot of bravery.
I I give you full marks for even trying it because yes, but I think it'll be excellent. You've already gotten published, so I'm sure it'll be wonderful. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. And for everybody watching, please in the ongoing mastery presenting and speaking group on LinkedIn, please give us your feedback. Please tell us what your storytelling thoughts are and connect with us on all the socials and connect with Laura. And we will see
Please
you
do.
next.
Thank you so much.